much for coming. If you're here for the event, can I ask you to come and take your seats, grab a drink from the bar? We'll be starting in about 15 minutes. All the seats are sold out, so please try not to leave any gaps. Get cozy, get to know the people you're sitting next to. And don't forget to wear your mask as well if you're not eating or drinking. Thanks, guys.
notice. This is your 5-minute warning to our official start time. Because the weather is so awful, we are going to give a wee grace period of 5 minutes at the beginning just to give people a chance to arrive. And then we will run 5 minutes after. So if you needed to shoot off on time, pick a seat at the end of a row. Hello, hello. Welcome. My name is Myri. I run Lighthouse, Edinburgh's Radical Bookshop. And the Radical Book Fair is my baby and Jess Gaetan Johannesson's brain baby. This event in particular is her brainchild, and she can't be with us tonight, but she might be watching from home. And if there's anyone watching from home, thank you for joining us. Thank you everyone who has braved the apocalypse that is happening outside to be with us tonight. For We Are It, community power in our time. The hope tonight is that you will go away seeded with a thought to go out there and do something, anything. Go and do. And to galvanize you into such action, we have a brilliant panel. And so I'm just going to ask you now to put your hands together to welcome tonight's panelists, Kate, Oliver, and Jeremy. All right. I'm going to start with Jeremy Corbyn's introduction, a man who would really need no introduction, but you're here anyway, so here we go. A socialist MP, founder and director of the Peace and Justice Project. He has served for 40 years as MP for Islington North in London, was twice elected leader of the Labour Party, and is a Parliamentary Member of the Council of Europe. He's a lifelong campaigner for peace, justice and human rights, and has been awarded prizes for promoting peace, including the Seán MacBride Peace Prize for his sustained and powerful political work for disarmament and peace. Will you put your hands together for Jeremy Corbyn? And to his left, we have Kate Pickett, who is currently Professor of Epidemiology at the Department of Health and Sciences, where she leads the Public Health and Society Research Group at the University of York. She is an academic co-director of Health Equity North. Kate is a fellow of the RSA and of the UK Faculty of Public Health and the Academy of Social Sciences. She is also the author of the award-winning, co-author with Richard Wilkinson, of the award-winning, yes, who's also here, of the award-winning and best-selling Spirit Level and The Inner Level. The Spirit Level was awarded Publication of the Year by the Politics Studies Association, chosen as one of the top 10 books of the decade by the New Statesman. It is also a really brilliant book. And tonight, Kate is with us representing Act Now, which was the book that sort of seeded this event. So would you put your hands together for Kate, please? And finally, on the end, we have Oliver Escobar, Professor of Public Policy and Democratic Innovation at the University of Edinburgh. He combines research and practice on participatory and deliberative democracy, community empowerment, and the governance of the future. He co-directed Critique, Centre for Ethics and Critical Thought, and co-leads on public engagement at the Public Engagement at the Behavioural Research UK and Political Economy at Inspire, Intersectional Spaces of Participation. Oliver authored Public Dialogue and Deliberation and co-edited the Handbook of Democratic Innovation and Governments, as well as Climate Assembly's New Civic Institutions for a Climate Change World. Before academia, he worked in construction, fishing, retail, radio, and literature. Will you put your hands together for Oliver? I should also point out for anyone who is surprised by the white ginger woman at the front, I am not Akugo Emajulu, who was supposed to be chairing tonight's event, but sadly has COVID. And so I'm really here to throw a couple of prompts at these guys and let them take it away. And then there will be time for audience questions at the end. There are a lot of you, so our rules are that a question is a short sentence with a question mark at the end. If you have comments, then you can share them with each other afterwards while you hang around and enjoy the space. There will be a signing as well at the back, and so if you don't get to ask a question, you can also ask a speaker at the end there. So I'm going to start by inviting some opening remarks from each of you to reflect on this idea of we are it, that change begins with us, and crucially perhaps that change is necessary in this time of crisis. And I'm going to ask you to start, Kate.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I was thinking...
You might need it slightly closer.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Great. So I was thinking about who has got power in this time of crisis and who hasn't. And that word crisis there's a lot in there. I was thinking about all of those whose wages have stagnated for so long, all of those who are living with insecurity and precarity. You know, the 1 in 10 people in this country who are in fuel poverty, the 4 million children who go hungry, everybody on those NHS waiting lists, waiting for the care that they need, everybody with a social care problem, a transport problem, a water problem, and globally, of course, everybody who's facing all of the problems that are being produced by climate change. That's a lot of crisis, and I'm not even touching on recent political crisis or war. But in those times, lots of people are powerless. They feel they haven't got power to change anything. But some people have got a lot of power. And who are the people with power? They are the rich. And what is it they have power over? It's power over us. They have the power to exploit us. They have the power to exclude us from places of exercising power ourselves. They get rich by extraction. They get rich through elitism. And so that's inequality. That's what inequality does for us. And the inequality that's created by the power that the rich then have is bad for all of us. And that's what Richard and my work has been about for all these years, is about the impact of inequality, you know, in the spirit level, showing that inequality creates a whole range of health and social problems, you know, big differences in more unequal societies, and that all of us suffer. And then in the inner level, we showed that the pathways that through which mental distress is created by that inequality. And last week, was it only last week, we were in Parliament launching a 15-year update of the analyses in the spirit level, and they look exactly the same as they did 15 years ago. Our country is still the most unequal in Western Europe. We still have all of the health and the social and environmental problems that creates. So, you know, I think we had always done our work thinking that if we would just show how problematic inequality is, somebody would do something about it, but really nothing changes. So I think what we were trying to do with the Common Sense Policy Group that has produced this book called Act Now was to ask, how can we shift that? What would a set of policies look like that would create a world in which we all felt empowered, in which we all felt we were part of democratic processes and policy making? And what that book is based on is thinking about policies that would meet 5 principles, that they would have to promote equality, make things more equal, that they would have to provide freedom from domination so that none of us are oppressed, that they would fit in with the social determinants of health framework so that they would be creating well-being for us all, and that they would be creating wealth in communities rather than among elites, and that they would be reducing inequalities between places so that they would be levelling up. And all of the policies that we put forward in the book are feasible, you know, they're doable, they're affordable, they're all costed by some brilliant economists, and they're all popular. And we actually, I think one of the innovations in the book is that everything that we talk about as policy change, we surveyed people to find out if they would like it. And we found that if we put the whole programme to people, 83% of Labour voters liked it in the red wall. 61.7% of Tories liked it. And that reminded me of one time when the BBC, I think it was, took some of your policies, Jeremy, from your 2019 manifesto to voters in Tory constituencies. And they didn't tell them whose they were, and they said, what do you think of these? And they loved them. Nationally, more than half of people who were planning to vote Conservative in the last election liked everything that was in our radical book. So I think that the popularity is with the people for the progressive policies that we don't yet have the power to enact. So I hope what all of us can do here tonight is think about how do we create that community of power at whatever scale that allows us to create the more progressive societies that we all want, all of us want.
Brilliant, thank you. And if I pass that on to you, the same question, that reflection on We Are It.
Well, first of all, Kate, thanks for that, and thank you for organising this great event here tonight. It's really good to have a discussion about issues of power, democracy and accountability, because that is a lot of what we're doing. When Kate and Richard produced their book, The Spirit Level, they came to my borough, Islington, and we asked them to help us undertake a participation of people in the borough about how we could make policies more equal and make the borough more equal. We have great wealth, and we also have 45% of our children living in poverty, which is probably worse than the national average. And I was, I must say, slightly sceptical about how well the book would be received publicly, but we put together a programme of events, and I just remember with absolute fascination one evening, hundreds of people turned up in a church, a bit like this, but not as cold, and discussed health inequality, life expectancy, childhood mortality, and all the other difficult issues that are faced by people, and access to health services, and also discrimination, knowingly or unknowingly, going on within the health services. These very open and frank discussions were then carried out in other policy areas as well, housing, education, and so on. And then every policy from then on written by the council had to take account of the equality demands put in that. And that was more than, 14 years ago now. And it's had some very good effects, because those policies are still there. And we have managed to build quite a lot of housing. We have managed to develop quite a lot, despite all the other problems that have gone on. And I'm very pleased we had that process. Because it seemed to me what politics is about is really the empowerment of people. Because think about it, we have a highly competitive education system in the UK, perhaps less so in Scotland, but it's still competitive. And so many 13, 14-year-olds are almost written off. You're not going to get good grades at your HIAs, your GCSEs, or whatever it happens to be, wherever you are. Therefore, you're not that important. The ones that are important are those that are going to achieve good things. What does that do to the psyche of the others? The idea that some are that they're not good enough. We're all very keen on looking at the success of others and then ignoring what's happening to the others that are not deemed to be so successful. So I do think we've got to look very hard at education, literature, and inspiration of people, and also the way the media depicts all of us about the disempowering of working class communities, the disempowering of working class living standards and lifestyle. So we have these ghastly programs like Benefit Street and things like that on, without ever examining why we have such levels of poverty and inequality in the fifth richest country in the world. And I'm really fed up with the idea that we sort of now almost extolling the virtues of food banks like it's a good thing. No, it's not. It's a terrible thing. They have to have them because people are hungry because they can't afford to eat. Surely we should look at why they can't afford to eat rather than the issue of where the food bank is going to be. So it is about empowering people. So I think, however, that there are some positive signs around. positive signs in that people do demand something different within their own communities, but also on a wider scale, they often don't recognise their own power. We were just chatting about this in the small room behind us before we came on, and I gave the example of Bolivia. When the water privatisation arrived in Cochabamba many years ago, actually some of the British water companies that had been made so asset wealthy by cheap privatisation in Britain were then trying to buy into the Bolivian water system. Somebody turned up who didn't like it and organised against it. His name was Evo Morales. He then organised against it, and that ended up with a total change, ultimately, in Bolivia of government, of constitution, of outlook, of the attitude towards indigenous people and everything else. Why? Because there was that sense of empowerment that something so fundamental as water was being taken away from them and given to a private sector enterprise. So never underestimate our own power. I was at a demonstration earlier this afternoon about Palestine. I said to the people there, it's a cold day, it's Edinburgh, we're a long way away from it all. I said, actually, what we say and what we do here matters, because we are saying we don't want these wars conducted in our name. We don't want weapons from here being used to carry out these dreadful acts that are going on at the moment. And so our power is of our voice, and our power is of inspiration to Palestinian people. So to me, power comes from people and what they're prepared to do. Now, I get some people who are very how should I put it, thoughtful in the Marxist tradition of politics say to me, Jeremy, is it the parliamentary road or is it the other road? Wow. Well, I've been 40 years in Parliament, so I suppose I have to answer that honestly. But what I would say is that it's not either or, if or no. It is about what we all do, and how you mobilise communities and what pressure they have and the effect they have of bringing about political change. When I was walking around earlier, I picked up this book called Havoc in its third year by Ronan Bennett. Ronan Bennett is a writer. He's done a lot of books, very imaginative. He used to work with me at one stage. And this book is about England in the 1630s through the eyes of a coroner who was supervising the reasons for people's death in the build-up towards the English Civil War. And it's a view of the empowerment of people. The English Civil War then brought about a republic and a democracy of a sort in England. It was people developed their own power because of the level of oppression they were under. And I just think that books, literature, poetry and inspiration do an awful lot to empower people. And I think that giving literature its space, giving poetry and inspiration and music its space, but it's also, above all, about giving people confidence. And our media do the very opposite. They always extol wealth, they always extol celebrity and personality, and people are deemed to be successful on the size of their car, the value of their house, or the number of holidays they take per year. How about we measure people's success on their contribution to the rest of the community, their contribution to the lives of all of us? And you'd begin to look at things in a very different way. And you'd see that road sweepers are actually very valuable people. You know, you look at it that way, they keep the place clean for the rest of us. Power comes from the people. Thank you.
Thank you. Same question.
Okay, great. So I'm going to try not to go over some of the things that Kate and Jeremy already mentioned. I guess, we need to start by recognizing where we are. And my daughter, Molly, was born last year at a time when we are undergoing the worst democratic recession in our lifetime, including everyone here. We are losing democracies by the week. Existing democracies are backsliding. Some democracies are becoming plutocracies. That means government by the rich. That's where we are. So how much can we expect from communities at this time of peril, in the middle of all this crisis? We happen to be facing this poly-crisis, as they call it now, precisely at the time when the capacity of democratic governance is reduced to an extent that we haven't seen before. It kind of was recovered during the pandemic because the state had to step up. But overall, democratic governance capacity to address the climate crisis, the inequalities crisis, the housing crisis, etc., it's acute. And that also means that our communities are under tremendous strain. They're, I won't go over things that Kale has already mentioned, but we live at a time where a lot of people are going through hardship, and the cohesion of our communities is being tested. And a lot of these, and many of these crises, they are material crises, but they are also crises of public imagination. Over the last century, we've reduced the scope of how we imagine democracy can be, the economy can be, the kind of societies we can build. That's perhaps one of the most difficult things to overcome over the next few years. That's going to be a big part of the work. Because unless we expand the public imagination, it's going to be really difficult to mobilize the resources that are going to be necessary to address some of these crises. The good news, though, is that despite all of this, there is a lot happening out there. Some of you will be familiar with this. Some of you might not be familiar with this, and that has a lot to do with the lack of visibility that some of the alternatives get, especially in mainstream media. So I want to offer just two examples, kind of areas that I think are quite exciting, and then we can get into it in the Q&A if you like to. One is to do with how do we bring communities into institutions, and how do we create new institutions for communities to direct the policy agenda, to shape decision-making, etc. And the other is the space of the commons, which is both under siege. We are seeing new enclosures of the commons by the corporate world, but also, paradoxically, as these things tend to happen, it's also undergoing a moment of revival. So let me start with the first one. Community power in communities of place, communities of practice, communities of interest, communities of identity is important. But if it stays outside institutions, it's not going to have the kind of impact. It's the point that Jeremy was making about the parliamentary road or the other roads. Well, I think there is another way of thinking about this. Parliament can be changed. Even in the United Kingdom, surely it can be changed. It can be changed in other countries. I'm originally from Galicia in Spain. You know, democracy is relatively young compared to this country. One of the things is that with all democracies, it's harder to change them, but they are not immutable. It can be changed. So Parliament can be changed. Citizens could be brought in. You could have a second chamber that was selected through lottery, bringing a random body of citizens rotating to have that dialectic with the elected chamber. That's one way we can get rid of the House of Lords and bring citizens right to the heart of the parliamentary process, for example, right? But also, we also need new institutions. And some of them, we have seen the prototypes. Think about participatory budgeting, for example, which in South America in particular had a tremendous impact in reducing inequalities, in reducing poverty, in channeling resources to some of the poorest communities, particularly in Brazil, but it then spread. Other versions of participatory budgeting are not as effective, and that has a lot to do with kind of taming its radical potential. But there are places where people are still fighting to turn participatory budgeting, which is a way of involving citizens in directly allocating public money, into something that can have that kind of effect. We have it in Scotland. There have been over 400 participatory budgeting processes. So check it out. It's happening somewhere near you. Edinburgh has a bunch of them. We need to grow it. It needs to become the mainstream way of allocating public budgets. There are all this is what we call the field of democratic innovation. It's things like participatory budgeting, climate assemblies, all forms of new digital crowdsourcing, etc., etc. They are endless, and they are happening all over the place. I highly recommend checking Participedia, which is the Wikipedia for participatory nerds. So Participedia, remember. And then the final point is, so that's one side of things. How do we bring citizens and communities into traditional legacy institutions and transform them, while also creating new institutions, again, like climate assemblies, for example. That's one area. The other area, so that's to do with the state, that's to do with institutions, that's to do with building a bridge from the streets to the institutions. The other area is the commons, which, we've been told this story that the world is organized around the market and the state, that bipolarity. It's a very toxic way of thinking about the world. The oldest form of social organization is the commons. It's community-owned spaces, community-owned energy systems, community-owned water systems, digital commons. Today in the world, around 2 billion people depend on the commons and manage the commons as the main means of sustaining their communities. So this is not an insignificant thing. This is a massive space. Yet you will hardly hear talking about the commons. In the UK, the commons means something else, of course. But now the commons, the revival of the commons is a really exciting development. We need to make it more visible. There are really exciting things happening with public commons partnerships, for example. Check it out in Barcelona, in some places in London as well. So this space of democratic innovation and advancing the commons, to me, gives me hope that we can build a new way of doing things, even in the shell of the old. And I think that that's the way it has to go. I don't think it's enough, and we might get to this, there might be a point of contention. I don't think it's enough going through the traditional channels, as important as they are. We also need to build the new economy as we go. We need to build new democratic institutions as we go. And in a way, it's not as if we have a choice. We are going to have to build this in the middle of a crisis, which is not ideal. A Brazilian thinker called Roberto Mangabeira Unger said a long time ago that we have become addicted to change through crisis. It seems that we cannot change. Our societies have lost the capacity to change unless we crash. The work now is to try and prevent the bigger crashes that are in our pathway. I think about Molly in the next 80 years or 90 years of her life, the things she's going to see. This is the moment. The work is right now. It's happening, though. So don't let people tell you it's not happening. It's happening. It's not visible. We need to make it visible and join it.
Before I ask my next question, just to flex that participatory muscle, can I get a show of hands for anyone who knew about climate assemblies or participatory budgeting happening in and around Edinburgh? There's no wrong answer. That's a good amount of you. How many have taken part in them? Okay, cool. I want to take us back just for positionality to a question around the sort of first building block, this idea of community. And just to ask you briefly to tell me what community means to you. What is the us that you feel a part of when it says we are it? Who is your we? Who wants to go first? Kate.
Oh, too many overlapping things, because I think whenever I think about community, I'm thinking about different scales. Do I feel European? Yes, I do. Do I feel like I belong in the village where I live? Yes, I do. So, I have an identity as a woman, an identity as a mother. I have an identity as an academic. I have, just so many. But also, I think because of the work I do has always been at different scales, comparing different countries to see how we do. So you sort of think about the community of a nation. And then I've done a lot of work regionally. So I think about the North, and I feel I identify with that community of the North of England. But I've done work locally. Jeremy, you mentioned fairness commissions, and Richard and I served on the York one as well, but I did work for Greater Manchester. on their Inequalities Commission. So I don't feel I can answer it very, very simply, and I do think that all of those communities matter. They overlap and they intersect, but they can work differently. And I suppose that's all the pathways apart from the parliamentary pathway, and they all have the power to collaborate with one another as well as work separately towards different ways of empowering people. But I think we can all be empowered through belonging to those different communities.
Who's jumping in next? Go for it.
I was very happy to use the word community ever since I heard Margaret Thatcher say there's no such thing as community. That's empowered me ever since. And a community is lots of things. It's, as Kate's described, it's almost impossible to define, but you sort of know what it is when you see it. It's a bit like an elephant in that sense. You know, you can't, nobody can describe an elephant, but if you see one, you're pretty clear it's an elephant, you know. There's no others around. A community is, yes, it's where you live. It's, yes, your immediate neighbours who you may or may not like, but you have a common interest in your street being clean, your street being safe, etc. It could well be, if you have young children, the community that often exists around the school, and I'm noticing that with local campaigns we've got over school closures because of falling roles and how the community responds to that. And there's an incredibly, as you all know, a very tight-knit community of parents and friends around, particularly primary schools, much more so than secondary schools. And then in the community that I represent, or area I represent, there's also communities of language, of Somali, of Lingala, of Swahili, of French, of Spanish, and so on. There are more than 70 languages spoken in my constituency, and those communities exist beyond the immediate geographical area. They exist in on a wider sense. Then there's the interest communities of people that are campaigning on environment or more specifically on traffic issues and things like that. And then there's the community of those people that campaign on great causes. And I've been very involved in a lot of things to do with Palestine, particularly over the past year, but for many years before that. And there's a sort of community of those people all over, and so they come together as well. So community is one of common interest. In general, it's positive. In general, it is positive about trying to improve things within that community of interest. But it can also be incredibly negative. And we're all, I should imagine, using mobile phones and on social media. And you read this sort of social media communities that exist and the sort of terrifying levels of abuse that are hurled at people for ever expressing an opinion on social media. I mean, I have long since given up reading the comments on my own social media posts because A, it would take too long, and B, I really don't need to stay up late at night reading abuse from people. But social media is a very powerful tool for information, but it's also a very dangerous tool in the sense it can belittle and isolate people and can lead to serious mental health problems, even suicide, as a result of it. So how you deal with that? Not simple, because, you know, do you want to restrict and all this? But so communities are good, is a good thing, but it can also be very exclusive. If you move into an area and you want to be part of that community, but you're the first person that's come there from the Caribbean, you had a hard time. Isolation, shunned, and all that. Happens all over the UK. And so you have to be aware that a community has to be built into a positive thing, not a negative, defensive thing against anyone deemed to be an outsider. And so this is why the sort of discussions that Kate was involved in on building social policies in a number of local authority areas were, I think, so brilliant and important, because the discussions I went to anyway were conducted in a very good and respectful way, and people often for the first time had their voice on their perception of how badly or well they were being treated by the health service or by local authorities. So community is something that we all say we believe in. And just to say the last thing about Margaret Thatcher, it does exist, it's powerful, it's successful, and it does bring about social change, all the social change that she wanted to reverse.
Maybe I'll start. The point Jeremy makes about the dark side of community is really important. I grew up in a very small town in the north of Galicia. Galicia is very conservative, Catholic country, rural area. I was the son of a trade unionist. Communities can be exclusionary, and communities. So communities are not a given. They need to be built. It's not a thing that is out there. It's something that we do collectively. But the power of community cannot be understated. If we build inclusive communities, they are the force that has moved history. You look at history, and anytime something important has happened for progress in humanity, for the advance of democracy, it's been communities pushing for it. It might be communities of place, communities of interest, communities of practice, communities of identity. So in a sense, there is something about community. It's a collective that is bound by material or imagined elements, right? Things that are tangible, or sometimes things that are imagined. And those are powerful forces, both material and imagined forces. The last point I'll make is on the point about social media, because the good news is that this social media, is not going to last much longer. Right? That is the good news. I mean, who here can remember the social media of 15, 20 years ago? Right? They disappeared, and the ones we have now are going to evolve as well and disappear. The good news, though, is that that's not the only spaces that we have online. So online, there is a space that is about, there's this contrast between digital herds and digital collectives. Digital herds is the stuff of populism, destructive populism, the pylons, the dynamic of followership and leadership in a toxic way. On the other side, you have digital collectives, which are based on dialogue and deliberation, which are an expression of participatory democracy. That's the battle in the digital public sphere as we speak. So don't be blinded by the dark side of the digital herds. Pay attention as well to the digital collectives that are trying to reclaim the digital public sphere and be part of them. I'm sure some of you here are already.
Thank you for that. I'm going to bounce back to you first with this next question, Oliver. I want to talk a bit about this idea of participatory democracy and invite you to share your thoughts on how we actually empower people, or people empower themselves to exercise democracy outside of election cycles. How do we act as citizens and global citizens outside of those election cycles, and why is that important? How do we do it? Why do we do it? If you want to go first.
Well, so the thing about participatory democracy, which in many ways is the original version of democracy, which, by the way, didn't start in Greece. That's a myth. That's a Eurocentric myth. Democracy is as old as humanity. Ever since humans started to get together in groups and had to make sense of their context and find a way of living together and making things happen, forms of communal self-governance have been there. They are as old as humanity. We know it from anthropology, we know it from archaeology. We now know that 3,000, 3,500, 4,000 years ago, we can see the beginning of democracy there. Greece is the story that is convenient to the Eurocentric story, but we find traces of democracy in all continents well before the Greek story emerged, the Eurocentric story emerged, which tells us that democracy is as old as humanity. It's a human story, and it's a universal story in the good sense of the term, right? So participatory democracy is the original form. Now, how do you scale it in a complex mass-level society? That's been the challenge for participatory democrats. And participatory democracy as a field, contemporary field, started in the 60s, trying to pick up some of the work that had been done just before the Second World War, when there's a strong battle between those who proposed that democracy at the scale can only be done through elites. We just need to trust elites to guide us. The best you can hope from people is that they can choose leaders wisely. And the rest, leave it to those leaders. That's the kind of democracy we've built, which of course doesn't work for a complex society where we need to solve complex issues, right? It doesn't work on a moral level either, but that's another story. So, when you're trying to think how do you articulate that kind of democracy, it cannot be just in the traditional spaces of political participation. It cannot just be in parliaments, institutions, policy spaces. It has to be in neighborhoods, it has to be in associations, it has to be in workplaces. Participatory Democrats want a democratic way of life to permeate the whole of society. That's how we develop democratic muscle, habits of democratic engagement. That's how we learn how to do democracy. Now, that muscle has not been developing a lot in the last few decades. It's more in some countries than others. But if you look around, you will see we are in Scotland. So in Scotland just now, there is a really large community development trust movement. There are hundreds of community development trusts. They take over land, they manage all kinds of assets, they develop all kinds of programs on transport, on housing, etc., etc. Now, that's an example of participatory democracy at play. You have the community wealth building movement, which again is gaining momentum in Scotland, as it did in Preston in England, in Cleveland in the States. Community wealth building is an example of building a participatory democratic economy. We have it as well. Even traditional institutions are making space. The Scottish government and the Scottish Parliament have had already 2 large-scale assemblies. Now, it always gets really tricky once you get legacy institutions interacting with democratic innovations. It's not straightforward. It's going to take time, and there's always a risk of co-optation, no doubt about that. We shouldn't be naive about that. But some of us think this can be the Trojan horses that get democratic innovators within institutions, and there are many of them. Don't be mistaken. Well, the biggest mistake I made when I finished studying political science was to believe some of the stories I had been told. The state is this monolith, the community is this monolith, all of it is homogeneous. That's not the case. You will find internal activists within institutions. You will have plenty of people for the status quo in communities. So what you need is to strike those unlikely alliances across those tribes of change makers that can be found in all these kind of spaces. And again, that has a lot to do with the kind of a story we tell ourselves about change and public imagination.
Thank you for that. If I can take it to you next, Kate, that same question.
I find that quite a hard act to follow. That was very inspiring. That was very inspiring, Oliver. Thank you. But, I was thinking about within the healthcare system, so speaking as someone who sort of acts within that in a certain way, it used to be within healthcare that the healthcare system did things to you, doctors did things to you. They didn't usually ask you if you were happy with that. They often didn't tell you what was wrong with you. That there was a very much a sort of top-down system, and that has really changed. And now, actually, even within research, we will not fund research unless patients and the public are properly engaged in meaningful ways. You can't get your research funded unless you do that. And if you do it in a superficial, tokenistic way, that is rejected. And you're told to come back and have put that properly in place. And I think that's quite a powerful symbol of change and of empowerment of people. We do now expect that patients are in a dialogue with healthcare providers, and we do expect them to be participating within research and not just agreeing to take part in it, but helping develop the research questions and setting the agenda. Mm-hmm. So I liked all the ways you were talking about, and that made me think about that healthcare setting. And I think you're right, and I should look harder at where things are happening within institutions that are already in place. One of the things I always liked that Andrew Sims did when he was at the New Economics Foundation was he did a thing. He said, let's play fantasy economics, and then he described a society that was like a utopia where everything was working perfectly, and the point was that all of those things were actually happening. They weren't all happening in the same place. So, something was happening in a different country and something was happening in a different community. But that description was that fantasy economics was all real. And I think that's the kind of thing that can inspire people, because it stops it feeling too fantastical. It starts to feel feasible and real and doable when you see that other communities or other groups of activists have achieved some kind of change in practical ways that you can imagine emulating yourself.
You next, Jeremy.
Like Kate, I absolutely welcome what Oliver said in the way he said it about democracy, that it comes from way before the Greek version of democracy, way before that, to many traditional indigenous societies had a very democratic way of going about things. That's how they survived. That's how they preserved their natural world. That's how they ensured they had enough food to get through famine and drought. And they did that because they utilised the skills of everybody. And I think we should sort of think a bit more about the purposes of democracy. We're sort of told you live in a democracy if you can vote for who's going to be in your parliament and who's going to be your leader. Well, that is a part of democracy, but it's only a part of democracy. If democracy consists of putting an X in a box every 4 years, well, that's not what do you do for the intervening time? Do you just accept everything that's thrown at you by that decision, or do you actually have some way of challenging, supporting, disagreeing, developing, whatever it happens to be? Tony Benn was a great thinker about social justice, and he developed and changed a great deal during his life. He was elected to Parliament very, very young. I think he was in his early 20s. And he probably didn't have the formed political opinions he had much later on. I've never forgotten, in the mid-1970s, he'd been in Parliament quite a long time by then, he became the Minister of Industry, and British Leyland, huge motor corporation, went bust, was to be taken into public ownership to save it from collapse altogether. And in what form should it be run? Should he appoint a board to run it, and they would just run it as a commercial operation, or should they do something very different? I was in the engineering union at the time, and he came to us and he said, it was amazing, a cabinet minister turns up at a union building, and he said, I want you to tell me what the workers want to do with it, and how they want to run it, and what their ideas are for the future. Extraordinary. And so he then gave the resources and facilities for all of us to spend best part of 6 months in discussion with every worker in British Leyland, in every factory, all over the UK, what they did, what they made, and what they would do with it, and how the company could develop, and how they could do it differently as well. And it was an amazing sense of liberation, in that suddenly workers were being told, well, do you really want to make lorries this way? Do you want to make it a different way? All that sort of thing. And that was then, he'd gone a bit too far for Jim Callaghan, so he was removed. And we went back to the old ways of running things. But that showed to me a sort of example of the way things can be done. I wanted to develop, as leader of the Labour Party, the Green Industrial Revolution, to do two things. One is to deal with the obvious reality that climate change is happening, that we are damaging the natural world and environment, we're destroying the biodiversity, we're polluting the air, we're polluting the rivers, and all that which you all are very, very well aware of. And more specifically, what do you actually do about it? And how do you deal with the endless conundrum of the needs, wishes, demands of people and the existing jobs and things that they do? And so we set up a series of green round tables around the country. I went to quite a lot of them. Rebecca Long-Bailey went to more than me. And some of them were absolutely fascinating. And the most fascinating one to me was in Blackpool. We invited a pretty random selection of people to come along and spend an afternoon with us in Blackpool. We deliberately divided up the round table so that friendly groups that came in together didn't sit together. They had to be with different people that they didn't know. And each was sort of asked various questions about how you would change Blackpool to make it more environmentally sustainable, how you would retain employment, develop employment, and so on, because it's actually quite an industrial town as well as being a holiday resort. It's also a very poor town. Absolutely fascinating, the imagination and ideas that were there. The problem is taking those ideas forward into policy making, as Kate, I'm sure, has often found in the work that she's done. But to me, that is what democracy is about. Democracy isn't just the vote. Do you have any rights at work or not? Yes, of course you have rights at work. You have to have a lot more rights at work. Industrial democracy comes into it, social democracy comes into it, and the running of our services. Like Kate, I was brought up on the idea that if you went to the doctor, you listened to the doctor, you didn't say anything unless you were asked to, and maybe not even then, and you would, you'd do as you're told. And I remember being in hospital once, and I was in a bed across the ward from this guy, and this old fella's in bed, and the professor comes round with his students, pokes this gentleman called Mr. Jones, and he says, "Now, students, Mr. Jones has a pain here. And now what do you think it is?" So at this point, Mr. Jones had got a bit fed up with this. He said, "Excuse me, doctor, the pain isn't here, it's here." And the doctor said, "Mr. Jones, if you don't mind, we're talking about you, not to you." and Mr. Jones was told to shut up. And so the doctor could get on with his own analysis of Mr. Jones' health problems without ever listening to him. Yeah, it was funny, actually. It was so ridiculous. But, these days things are very different. You do challenge professionals, and rightly so, because I'm a whole person. I'm not an ear that that's got an infection. There's a whole reason behind it. And so it is the holistic approach to life that we've got to address. But above all, it's giving people the confidence to do that. So in school, let's have the school councils, let's have the school participation, let's have the school imagination, and let the kids challenge the curriculum if they want to. Is that so bad? Is it so bad? They say, well, actually, we really don't want to learn about the Normans today. We want to know what happened to the Romans or whatever else. Give kids their heads. And that way you never know where it's going to lead to. It might even lead to democracy.
A lot of your responses dovetail and cover some of the ground in my last question, and then I'm going to take it out to you. So put your thinking caps on. And then at the end, when I go, and it's your turn for questions, if you fling up your arms, I will be able to see roughly where I'm moving, and I will try and take a couple at a time with the relatively short amount of time that we have left. So my last question is around where you have seen community organising actually translate into real policy making, where you have seen that enacted in real life that we could learn from. Oliver, you first.
Okay, I'll try to be brief. I know we are already a little bit over time. I hope people are okay. Those watching the live stream are okay, but you made the effort to come through the slash. Kate mentioned utopias. That's great because there's another name, and you will find this in the literature, for the field of democratic innovation, is the field of real utopias. Because these are things that are happening in reality with the messiness of it, in policy making, in governance spaces. Take the example of climate assemblies, right? Where is the... So, and you will hear there are a lot of critics of climate assemblies, right? They are not perfect, no institution is, of course, but they have barely begun. I mean, it's the first some of the first climate assemblies were just 5-6 years ago, right? Although citizens' assemblies have been around for 20 years, mini publics, which is the broader family to which these belong, are 50 years old. So, like juries, panels, things like that. Now, climate assemblies tend to all, and bear in mind that these are not self-selected groups. This is a cross-section of the population. So that you have some of the richest and some of the poorest, some of the most educated, some of those who didn't have a chance at formal education. You know, you have a range of people from the relevant society in the room, listening to all kinds of stories and evidence and perspectives, deliberating and producing recommendations. Climate assemblies have so far produced recommendations, and we're talking countries, France, UK, all over Europe, and now also in other parts. They tend to always be far more radical than existing policies. Take the case in France. For example, you might have heard that France banned internal flights, right? If you can reach a place by train. That came from the French Climate Assembly. You probably didn't hear that part, right? That's the thing, right? Because legacy institutions take the credit for some of these new things when it works well, but they don't always give them the power. So it's kind of... if you look at the Scottish Climate Assembly that we had a couple of years ago, well, it was during the pandemic, actually, so it was the first ever fully digital assembly. Over 100 speakers, 100 members of the assembly, the Children's Parliament involved, so they were the first ever climate assembly that included children and young people. Probably, this is an aside note, the last accepted exclusion from democratic engagement in society, which is appalling, and we can't afford that given the climate crisis. But that's a footnote. The Scottish Climate Assembly, if you look at the 81 recommendations, you're going to see there stuff that really would push the boundaries. So the issue is not necessarily, the problem is not some of these new processes. The problem is the barriers that existing institutions put in the way of these new processes and how some of them are manipulated. But we shouldn't be naive. That's to be expected. It's not going to be easy, right? I am suspicious of those who are overly skeptical too soon. Right? In some places, democracy has been hundreds of years old, some kind of form of democracy, yet we're expecting democratic innovations to have it all figured out in just a few decades. That's unfair. That makes me suspicious of those who are rushing to judgment on this space. And just to finish, a quick point. There is the issue of a scale that always people but Jeremy mentioned industrial economy. You know what the number 8 largest business in Spain is? The Mondragon Cooperative, the largest cooperative in the world, right? So scale is not an issue. It wasn't before, and certainly it's not now. So many of these ways, I guess one of the things for me, that's why I kept going back to this question of the public imagination. Until we realize the fundamental contradiction of believing that it's enough to have a democratic polity while we still have an autocratic economy, that's the fundamental contradiction, and that's still not clicking. So anyway, I'll stop there. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. I mean, my mind also ran to citizens' assemblies, and I think, looking at what happened in Ireland around abortion rights was a very, very powerful example of that. But I was thinking more informally as well, on the drive on the way up here, talking about this with Richard, is that things like the civil rights movement and feminism and all of those other progressive movements that have seen rights extended to groups of people who didn't have them previously have all been grassroots movements. They've all been led from below. They've all been led by brave activists and campaigning. They've never sort of come because elites decided to extend those rights downwards. So I think any time we get together as a group and decide to be activists, to protest, to work for change, we are taking part in something that will eventually, even if we can't see it immediately, it will change policy. It will change the way people think about what is right and what is just.
It's good to be reminded.
The societies under oppression always reach for a community response, and a demand for democracy that goes with it. So you think of the most brutal forms of colonialism, the independence movements always started with demands for a voice, demands for a vote, and demands to be able to be heard and be represented. And that, in most cases, ended up with independence from the imperial power. The point that Oliver was making about Spain and cooperatives is absolutely fascinating. Spain does have a massive co-op tradition, does have a huge cooperative movement. That movement didn't start after Franco died. It was there a long, long time before, during the Republican period, and it survived 40 years of fascism in Spain, the ideals behind it, and it's now stronger than ever as a cooperative movement, as a form of employment, as a form of consumption, and a form of empowerment. And so I think you could look at a lot of successes. And if you think about the changes in transport policy that have happened all over Britain over the past 25, 30 years. 30 years ago, the whole rubric was cars into cities, more roads, less public transport, let's get on with it, and build more roads, sell more cars, and so on. And I remember being told I was completely mad but for opposing a road widening scheme in the 1970s. And they said, well, why? There's more cars coming, we need wider roads. I said, maybe we need smaller roads with more buses on and fewer cars. People thought it was completely bonkers. And then 5 years later, we had a London transport plan which did the opposite of diminishing London transport and public transport use, developed a very high level of good quality public transport, fewer cars, road space being reallocated towards pedestrians. It's not total, it's not complete in every way, but that was a citizens' movement that achieved that. It was a citizens' movement that stopped that. And one other quick example, I remember in the last Parliament, the government came up with some scheme that they were going to privatise the Forestry Commission. And I thought I'd misread something when they said they're going to. I thought it was completely crazy. And so I sort of read this thing in the Evening Standard. They're going to privatise the Forestry Commission. Within 2 hours, there was this massive social media campaign started against it. And I knew we were going to win on it because I went to the Conservative end of the tea room in the House of Commons. They were all saying, have you seen all these hundreds of emails from all these crazy people who are against us privatising the Forestry Commission? We've got to drop it. And it was all dropped in 3 days. It was utterly amazing. An immediate public reaction, only possible because there was a community of common interest on it, which transcended every part of the UK. Even totally urban areas like mine don't have any forests at all. It can work. And so democracy is about coming together. And let's not minimise our successes. That's what we're always doing. We put ourselves down and don't realise how powerful we are. So let's pick it up for being powerful communities, okay?
Where are my hands? There we go. I've got one over there and one there. And I might need you to... Yes. I was like, that mug might not survive this. Okay. I'm coming to you. If you can keep your hand in the air... There we go. I'm going to go 1, 2, and 3, and that might actually be our only 3.
I just wanted to ask what you think about leadership and community, especially in a culture that tends to look at individuals as being the only existent creatures, as it were. How do you fight that and turn it into a more community-based culture?
Thank you. I wanted to ask, how do you get institutions to make that space for communities and actually put the resources in to, make these innovations succeed, because we are so scared of sharing power?
I will let you start answering those two, and I will go to the third person while you go for it.
Right, they're all scribbling. On leadership and sharing leadership, I think that's quite challenging, and it's something that we all have to do. And in an unequal society, where status attaches to your ability to earn a lot of money or ability to lead something. It's quite hard to foster egalitarian impulses and be willing to share power and share leadership. So it's challenging, but it can be done. And I think I would like to point to our new book here, which is published by a collective of people. And within it, you can't tell who wrote which bit, because we wanted it to be a book that came from a group of people. And that was negotiated very nicely in a very caring and sharing way. So it can be done even when you've got all kinds of authorial sort of egos to play with.
So on leadership, actually, this is such an important question because, there's such a totemic view of leadership, and it's all around us. It's in the media all the time, notions of leadership. The thing is, there's nothing to say that leadership is about individuals. Historically, leadership was always a distributed capacity, a capacity that was distributed across a community, across a system, an organization. So leadership can be collective, right? And there are styles of leadership that lend themselves to the kind of democratic innovations I've mentioned. It's often what we call participatory leaders or facilitative leaders. And these are leaders who are not pretending they have all the answers and they are just asking you to follow them. These are leaders who know how to bring people together to make things happen. And it's a different style of leadership. It's a humble style of leadership, a style that says, I'll do it for a while, then you step in, and we keep going, we keep rotating, right? So we need to stop thinking of leadership in individual terms and more in collective terms. That's what's going to take to face some of the things we are facing. An important part of that, though, is to think about power differently as well. While the conversations I've had with politicians over the years about democratic innovations and whether there should be a space for them, is that some politicians fear that they are going to lose power if they share power. But actually, there's another way of the participatory democracy way of thinking about power is that sometimes when you share power, you generate power that wasn't there before. When you use participatory budgeting to allocate 100 million euros, like the city of Madrid has done for many years up until recently, you're going from allocating those funds on the basis of a conversation between 10 people in a committee behind closed doors to mobilizing thousands of people to put forward ideas, projects, to mobilize new energy and resources to implement things. You're generating new power that wasn't there. This is happening in the northeast of Scotland as we speak. Green participatory budgeting, part of the just transition in the northeast. You're all of a sudden unleashing, it's small so far, but you're unleashing a lot of energy. Dozens of community groups and initiatives springing out. You cannot come up with that in a committee behind closed doors between 10 people. You're not going to mobilize that energy, that power. So power is not just a zero-sum game. You can generate power by sharing power. And the politicians who get this, and there are some who do, these are the democratic innovators that then open the windows of opportunity. And that goes to the other question. We need those internal activists. I've met civil servants, politicians. They are a minority, but I've met them. At the moment, it's a bit of a critical mess, right? The bits here and there in pockets, burning themselves out, fighting their internal systems. So how do we go from that critical mess to a critical mass, which is when real change can then happen? The last point I'll make on this is, is this question of windows of opportunity. Look at how the Scottish Climate Assembly happened. Right? There was the new Climate Act in 2019. It was about to pass. Extinction Rebellion, Fridays for Future, and others were demonstrating, were asking for a climate assembly. A climate assembly was added to the legislation. It came from the streets, and then Parliament took it, and then the assembly happened. Right? So there are these windows. These need to be used. There's something really paradoxical about climate assemblies being supported by the OECD, by United Nations, by Extinction Rebellion. Right? You know why? Because it's an in-between space. It's a liminal space. What that means is that it doesn't belong to anyone. It's trying to build a bridge, a new type of space. So those are the windows of opportunity.
Well, leaders have to come from somewhere, and they have to be accountable. And the danger point is when they assume in politics enormous power and then remove the accountability that put them there in the first place. And that's when you end up ultimately with dictatorships. So you have to ask yourself the question, are the democratic checks and balances on leadership sufficient? I think within the British Constitution they're absolutely not. And the more one looks at the British parliamentary system, you realise how weak Parliament is vis-à-vis the government and how strong the government is vis-à-vis Parliament. And the same applies with the Scottish Parliament, which has even less powers than the House of Commons. And it doesn't even have the parliamentary autonomy of the House of Commons. And so you've got to be, if you're to be a genuine leader, you've got to recognise where you come from and recognise that you're accountable to those that put you there in the first place. That's not to say you shouldn't try and do bold things and try and set out a vision of what you want to do, but you've got to take people with you. If you don't, then either you end up losing out or you end up removing those very things that are supposed to keep you under control. And leadership is... I would quote Tony Benn again. He said, the best leaders are those that are forgotten, and people decide they brought about the changes without any help from the leaders at all. They did it themselves. And so maybe leadership is about a conglomeration of aspirations and ideas that are then put forward, but make sure they're not put forward by one person, they're put forward collectively. But above all, you're in a position to listen to those that you are presuming to lead. If you don't listen, then you end up actually not being very effective, because you have to be prepared to listen to the criticism as well as to the support. Otherwise, you don't get anywhere. And that applies in all aspects of life. It applies whether you're running a school, running a factory, running a hospital, running a bus company, or whatever it is. If you listen to people, they're empowered, and you're empowered in order to carry out their wishes. That's what leadership looks like to me.
Thanks. This has been a very substantial and inspiring conversation. I think Kate's point was really important about lots of people in the population supporting radical policies. But when we go out there, there's still a lot of confected kind of culture wars conversations driving the narrative. So kind of transphobia and homophobia, Islamophobia, xenophobia, increasingly misogyny and anti-feminism. So how do we take the anger that people feel from kind of disenfranchisement and dispossession as a temporary community in this room, and how do we kind of go out there and alchemize that into some of the work that we've been talking about today?
Beautiful question. No pressure, guys. Do you have an answer?
I feel like I've spoken so much. I'll have my last go then.
What do you think?
Yeah. So the thing is, we there's a lot of talk about polarization, social division. This is real. I mean, as real as the punch in the face that were the U.S. elections, right? Many people did not see these divisions, not just in terms of ethnicity and gender, but class, right? And there's a big return to class, because otherwise we're not going to make sense of what's happening around the world. So intersectionality is a key to understanding a lot of this. These things are real, but they are also manufactured in the sense that, if you go to communities that are truly diverse, where people live alongside each other, often the most striking things is that you will not find these kind of things. What tends to happen is that this is concocted and used by elites to divide communities, because then that means that we need to rely on the hierarchy for others to deal with divisions in society, right? So it's very, let me go back to the origins of participatory budgeting in Belo Horizonte, in Brazil, in Porto Alegre. How did they manage to collectively decide to channel hundreds of millions of dollars towards some of the most impoverished areas, the slums? And how did they do that? How did they build all those schools, all those new health centers, all the things that happened there? Was it because elites negotiated on behalf of people and managed it? No, it wasn't. It was people meeting each other. It's people across different backgrounds facing each other. And it's very, very easy to dismiss or hate a faceless stereotype. When you come together in a community space, face to face with others, then it's really, really difficult to hold on to the kind of stereotypes and the divisions and the, So this is what happened in those cities that I mentioned earlier. They started to say, actually, we are going to put on hold our vanity project in our middle class area. We're going to channel resources to your area because you're dealing with some really urgent stuff. Those solidarities only happen when we create spaces that do not predate on divisions and stoke them up, but actually bring people together in a space that are designed to be participatory, to be dialogic, to be a space where people can meet each other as humans, rather than leaving that job for elites to sort out.
Thank you.
I was just sort of saying to Kate there just now, maybe if you're trying to persuade people not to be alarmed by people who think and do things differently, look at the absurdity of some of the stuff that was done in history. So I'd sort of encourage people to watch and read The Witches of Salem and what it did to people and the way a whole society collectively abused people because they believed them to be witches, which was obviously absurd at every rational level, but at that time it wasn't seen as absurd and it was seen as totally rational. And so extreme racism can seem extremely logical to extreme racists, and those that have phobias about Judaism, about Islam, about Christianity, about gay rights or about trans rights or something else, they should think for a moment about the absurdity of their position and recognize that actually a strong society and a strong community is one that doesn't just recognize difference, doesn't tolerate difference, but respects difference and respects the way in which people come to their own way of living, their own way of thinking, and their own religious or other activities. That's what actually makes for a much stronger society. And you have to get that message home all the time. And it does mean you have to challenge discrimination, you have to challenge racism wherever it appears. If you don't, then you end up going down the road of appeasing those forces, and that leads us all into a very, very dangerous situation. It's never easy, and it's never easy for those people that have paved the way. But those people that formed the US civil rights movement in the 1950s in the southern states of the USA, they'd had 100 years since the end of the US Civil War that was supposed to end slavery and racism and everything else in the United States. It maybe had formally ended slavery, but it hadn't ended the racism that went with it. And those people that stood up and were abused and beaten and imprisoned and killed actually changed the law and changed attitudes and changed life. And I think we should just see them as people, as real heroes who stood up against the mob in order to bring about justice for the future.
The last word to you.
Well, I started this conversation, didn't I, by talking about the horrible crisis that we're in and all the things that are very challenging for us. But I wanted to end on a more optimistic note, because we are not in the kind of crisis that our comrades and friends and family are across the Atlantic or in other places around the world. And we're all in this lovely, not very warm, but sparkly space, having good conversations about what we can do to increase community spirit. And I just think that before the next general election, we all need to leave this room, I think, this space, thinking about what we can do to prevent our democracies here getting as fragmented as they have elsewhere. What can we do to prevent the right from making more inroads on our democracy here? What can we do to stop the kinds of fear that got mongered following the murders in Stockport and led to the riots earlier? This feels like quite a critical moment to me as we think about what do we do to ensure that the next time we have a general election, we are not in a more polarized place, but that we are in one that is more connected and more cohesive because of everything that we all do to create that.
Thank you.
We have run over, but I have just a couple of points to make, and then I'm going to bounce back to Jeremy for a second. If you need to run, it's not rude. The signing table that we have is over in the corner that during the day is the lovely Lavender Menace queer bookstall. So it's over down that side. There are 2 exits to the building. If you are just heading out and you don't want to stick around, you can go out this way. The books are available on the bookstall at the back, and you can join the signing queue, which will go along this side. We have another event in just a wee bit, the Queer Arab Glossary with Marwan Kavour, which is an extraordinary book. So if you don't want to go out into the cold, stay in the slightly less cold for a beautiful discussion of queer Arabic slang. From a beautiful book. There was something else I've forgotten, but while I try and remember that, Jeremy didn't mention this very brilliant book, and we're talking about creating these spaces in between, and here's a book about the arms trade where people are answering that call to do something about some pretty rotten stuff. Could you give us just a wee brief about what this is?
30 seconds on this. We're in an era of wars. Ukraine, Russia, Palestine, Sudan, Congo, Yemen, West Papua, all around the world. Globally, we're spending $2.4 trillion per year on armaments, almost $1 trillion of which is spent by the United States. The power of the arms trade and the arms trade to lobby on policies and provoke incidents and provoke the development of more and more extreme weapons, including nuclear weapons and space-oriented weapons, is enormous. And through the Peace and Justice Project, Laura Alvarez, my wife, who does the international work for Peace and Justice Project, decided to put together this book called The Monstrous Anger of the Guns. The title comes from the Wilfred Owen poem of the First World War, where in his poem Anthem for Doomed Youth, which was a very powerful poem, he says, "What passing bells for those who die as cattle, only the monstrous anger of the guns." And this book is globally written, so it was complicated to put together. You think you had a complicated thing. We were writing from 5 continents and trying to get everybody to do it more or less to the same time. It's worked, I think, extremely well. We'll probably do a follow-up based on the reception we get for this book. It challenges the arms trade, the lobbying power of the arms trade, and the corruption that goes with it. But it also, and this is the important part, looks to provide an alternative. We don't blame people for working in the arms industry. We want to develop those skills to do other things and make other things. If ever there was a book that was a tract against the times, it's this one. And that's why we've produced it. We're doing an event on it tomorrow afternoon at Glasgow University. We've already got 400 people registered to come to it tomorrow afternoon. There's still a few spaces there, so go online if you're able to come to get to Glasgow tomorrow at 1 o'clock. And we're going to have a full discussion about the book. It's been an absolute joy and pleasure to produce it and provoke the discussion about it. So, and there's some copies available at the back. So thank you very much.
Thank you. While these beautiful people make... What's the dog's name?
Dog? It's a good dog.
It's a good dog. You can meet the dog after. The dog's near the signing table.
The dog always barks at the right
while these beautiful people make their way out the back, I've remembered the thing I was going to say, which is the books are on the till. Your tickets were £6 vouchers that you can use off either book if you want to take a copy home. If you are broke, we have pay it forward tabs that are on the board, and you can use other people's money that they have gifted you to go home with a book. And if you have excess money, you can give your voucher to somebody who doesn't have it. So that's all on the board as a little bit of, pass it forward. So we'll see you out there. Oh, and if the other event starts while you're still in a signing queue, if you just keep it down so we can have both spaces coexist.